Hey folks, thanks for joining us live if you are here. If you're watching after, that's okay too. Glad to have you. My name is Alex Martin. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Build Carolina. And more relevant to our topic today is I've kind of led and worked with our apprenticeship program for the past coming up on 3 years, which is wild to think about. I am joined tonight by Lauren McGlamory, the awesome, the amazing engagement manager from our team, who's going to be watching chat. So if you have contributions, we'll talk a little bit about how to get involved in the conversation, and also helping us out with recording, management, checking in with folks, just generally being awesome behind the scenes as she always does. So Lauren, glad to have you. Y'all, I hope you have had a full day of watching cool events this National Apprenticeship Week. We're really happy to be part of it. And tonight, I'm going to be focusing a lot on apprenticeship from an employer perspective. We're going to take a little drive through the history of apprenticeships. We're going to talk about modern apprenticeships and how registered apprenticeships, and in particular, registered apprenticeships in the tech sector, are really changing the face of who has access to these careers in this industry. And then we're going to wrap up with a few examples from around the world, things we can learn from them, and kind of tips and tricks. I am curious, before we dive in, for those of you who are here with us live, how many folks are coming from the perspective of an apprentice, thinking about trying to join an apprentice track? Feel free to raise your hand on camera, or if you're off camera, you can use a Zoom reaction. All right, thanks Marjorie, thanks Alicia. Awesome, thanks Evan. So I asked this question because a lot of the content I'm going to be going through is written for employers, and we will go through that. But I want to encourage y'all thinking about how to get into an apprenticeship to kind of flip your mindset here and consider how employers might be looking at you and kind of understanding how these programs are built, because I think that's going to help you with your success in moving into these programs. And as we talk tonight, I want to really encourage y'all to get involved. And I will talk more about, again, how to do that and kind of what we can talk about as we're going through. I've put together about 30 minutes of talking notes, so we have plenty of time for questions and answers and digging in deeper together. That's the whole benefit of doing these sessions. With that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and let's jump in. All right, I want to make sure I can pull everybody's faces up where I can see you nice and easy here too. So what I want to talk about tonight is starting with apprenticeship. And there's going to be a lot of context to this, but really this is kind of a new way to think about applying apprenticeships to your workforce and your team, and really where you want to go with bringing new people in, bringing folks who are what we would consider either early career or at least early to a particular skill set. And I want to introduce myself so you have some context about why I'm talking about this. Because anybody could get up here and talk about it, and that's not worth taking even 10 minutes of your time to listen to. But I've got a little bit of background here that's specialized in this space. And I think the perspective I bring is data-driven, and not only from my own experience, but also some pretty big players. Now, my work history for the past decade has been in tech education. Not to be confused with ed tech, though I've done some work in educational technology as well. There's plenty of overlap there. I've worked with a lot of the big recognizable names in the boot camp and non-traditional education space. Some of these you may recognize, some of them you may not. Some of them are still around, some of them are not. But I've also worked with tech companies. So I've done embedded training with places like GitHub and Microsoft to help support their efforts as well. And currently, I mentioned earlier, I'm the CTO for Build Carolina, which is a nonprofit focused on expanding and engaging South Carolina's tech talent ecosystem. We really try to identify and fill gaps with our programs as we talk to early career folks and talk to employers and figure out how we can kind of be the glue between those teams. And the way we've done that in the apprenticeship sector is with what we call currently Develop Carolina. And Develop Carolina is Build Carolina's apprenticeship program. It's a 6-month supported apprenticeship where employees join their host companies for 24 hours a week and also get training on technical skills to help them level up specific to their employer, and less technical skills that may be more valuable. And we'll dig more into that here in just a little bit. I also come from a medical background. So while the last 10 years of my career have been focused on non-traditional education and technology skill up, 17 years before that, I worked as an autopsy technician. I've gone to medical school. I am familiar with what may be one of the most rigid and recognized apprenticeship systems in the world through medical education. And I know what those traditional systems look like, have experienced them for myself, recognize their strengths and honor those, but also recognize the weaknesses in them. And I think when I mention kind of having a unique perspective, this is something that I bring to the table that has really influenced how I think about non-traditional programs. I've gone kind of as far as you can go down the traditional pathway. And comparing and contrasting those things is something I kind of get a kick out of. I really enjoy talking about the stuff that we're going to dig into tonight. So speaking of, what's our goal here? I want to help the broader community understand how traditional apprenticeships evolve. Some of that is sort of natural. Like I said, we'll take a little tour through time and look at where apprenticeships started and how they've organically changed. But some of that is forced. And I want us to think about how we can apply new models, new learning, new technology specific to the work that we do to those old models. We can honor the things that got us here without having to cling to them to our detriment. And I think that's really important, and that's something I want to slice into here. And then finally, I mentioned this a little bit earlier as well, I want to look outside of us. There are great programs in the US. We'll talk about those. We'll bring up some cool names, but there are also great programs overseas. There are great programs on different continents, great programs with lots of different people. And I want to dig into those and understand either why they're successful or why they're failing and what we can learn from that, those changes. Now, a really, really key piece of any time I talk to folks, whether I'm in a classroom or I'm on a stage or I'm talking over Zoom like this, is that this is a discussion. I don't want to talk at y'all any more than you want to listen to me talk at you. So for those of you who are here live, please feel free at any time to contribute. If you've got examples from your own life that you think are relevant, let's talk about them. If you have questions or you want to dig deeper on a topic that's on the screen, stop me before we go too far, because that's the best time to talk about that stuff. If you're comfortable coming on camera or coming on mic and just sharing outright, that's totally fine. But if you'd rather type in chat, this is where I'm really glad to have awesome Lauren helping out with this presentation. She's going to be watching chat for us, and she will alert me if something comes up that is relevant that we can jump into, or maybe hold some things back if we know it's coming a little bit later. So feel free to ask those questions and add that context if you feel like, hey, I got to know right now. You won't be interrupting me. That's a good thing. If you'd rather kind of drop a question while you're thinking about it and let us come back around to it, we can do that too. Just let us know how you want to contribute and we'll involve you as much or as little as you're comfortable. I have already checked in with where folks are in terms of employers versus student perspectives. And again, I will kind of try to tailor my content to support our mostly live apprentice-focused group tonight. But we're going to be talking a lot about what it means to build an apprenticeship, what it means to grow an apprenticeship, and why you might want to, why you may want to think about things hopefully a little bit differently after this talk than you did before. Does anybody have any questions before we jump into the history of apprenticeship? We're going to go way, way back, so I want to make sure we're comfortable in the present before we hop in the time machine here. All right, Lauren's laughing at me. That's a good or bad sign. I'm not sure which. All right, let's jump in the time machine, y'all. And let's start talking about where apprenticeship came from. So I warned you we're going to go way back. We are going way, way back. Apprenticeship is not a new thing. We're here today. The theme of today for National Apprenticeship Week is new and emerging markets and new types of apprenticeships. But I'm going to go back to the OG. And the OG actually goes way back even before medieval history. This is kind of the oldest picture I could find that seemed to sum things up. Apprenticeship really comes out of the early craftsmanship movements. If you look at European history, though this is mirrored in lots of different cultures around the world, tradespeople and artisans started to come together as teams and realize that, hey, we want to be able to grow our skills. We want to take advantage of new workforce and make sure this is something that sticks around. And so as they started to standardize, they also started to train. Apprenticeships at this time were not what we think of today as a trade-focused apprenticeship. It was a lifestyle. When you joined an apprenticeship in medieval Europe, you were probably 8, 9, 10 years old, and in many cases being arranged into the apprenticeship through your family. And so you would be living and working on site with a master craftsperson or artisan for 7, 10, 12, maybe 15 years before you even received the recognition that you needed to work independently. Good news is this was a really great way to build standards of craft. This was something where, a craftsman's guild, people who were working on a particular sort of industry or trade at that time, could really make sure that everybody had this experience and had this exposure. The bad thing is it was very, very unregulated. It was very exploitative, and think about the limited number of opportunities and the limited access folks had to this. There's lots of documentation, even going back this far, to the fact that apprenticeships became sort of a corporate exploitation movement, and there needed to be a little bit more there, because people would spend 10 or 15 years living in the basement under a master baker's home, and then not be able to open their own place or hire people when they completed their contract. This was an early structured form of indentured servitude. So at least in that respect, we have come a long way as companies and people who are participating in and sponsoring apprenticeships. This model really didn't change that much for a very, very long time. We start at the 1400s, we jump up to the 1800s, and there's not much difference. There's still a lot of kind of handing, especially young people, off into these trades. There's limited opportunity outside of that unless you happen to choose the right trade or there's big expansion. But one thing that did change a lot during that time is the focus of the guilds and craftspeople who took on apprentices. We shifted with industrialization from having apprenticeships in creative arts and early thought work more into industrial and engineering applications. So trades shifted more to things like construction, foundry working. If there were craft trades, they were typically started to kind of shrink down to families. And we saw much larger scale apprenticeship operations start to come in with the Industrial Revolution, the late 1800s period. During that time, we saw that become an even more exploitative model. And this is when you had really unprotected labor, child labor, really terrible living and working conditions. It's an exciting time from a scientific advancement standpoint and building and doing new things, but a little bit of a dark time for the history of apprenticeship. So again, I say this just to kind of give that historical context of what these programs were doing and also to think about how far we've come. Now, something I think is important, we're going to take a little break here and talk more theory than application, is what an apprenticeship represented at that time. For these centuries of apprenticeship that we experienced, again, not just in Europe, but around the world. We tend to think with kind of a European mindset here, but this was happening with military apprenticeships in Africa. This was happening in Asia and the shukonin and craftsmanship culture. This wasn't limited to just Europe. Apprenticeships are sometimes referred to as bridges. That's, we use that example with Build Carolina and our apprenticeship program. But you see that brought up in a lot of other places. And the bridge that these traditional, original apprenticeships represented is a really long bridge. This wasn't something where we're just seeing a little gap and going, hey, we can fill that with an apprenticeship. This was a lifelong bridge where you were taking someone who is a total layperson with little to no experience in the space that you're working in and taking them all the way up to an artisanal level of mastery. It is highly controlled. It is highly exploitative. It did also create opportunities. And these really, really long bridges worked well for a very long time, but as the world sped up, they've become harder and harder to sustain at that. Now, I mentioned kind of the global view, right? This is happening in lots of different places in lots of different ways, but I want to be a little patriotic here for a minute and look at the early 1900s, because around this time, around the world, the idea of apprenticeship and labor and expanding markets was really, really changing. The US did it one way, not the best way or the worst way, but a pretty representative way of how other countries engaged in this model. And there's some things we're going to point out as we think about what the next iteration of apprenticeship should look like. They're going to point back to some kind of key points in history here. In 1917, we really had our first government partnership leading to supporting apprenticeships and vocational education. That was called the Smith-Hughes Act. Now, this actually was pushed on Congress, and I don't know all the history about drafting it. If you're a history major, please correct me later. I'd love to know more. But this was really sponsored and initiated by a teacher who turned into an attorney and was later a superintendent and a philanthropist, who realized that the academic pathway was being used by a lot of folks as an escape from traditional trades. And we were starting to lose really important things like craftsmanship, like agriculture, like large-scale industry that was dying off with families because the academic process, the academic pathways at the time only took people into thought work and outside of production and tradescraft. And so the Smith-Hughes Act created a partnership between state and federal governments to bring money in as long as education providers offered a vocational track. Really, really cool thing is we still use that model. The idea of the federal government matching state funds to support vocational training is an idea that modern apprenticeship is based on. That's still something in the US. That's something we take advantage of with our apprenticeship. It's a really, really great way to partner with resources. Challenges of the Smith-Hughes program was the vocational track really segregated programs in between people going directly into the workforce and people going into academia. That's something that stuck around in modern public education and is a little bit of a plague today. It's a challenge that we face. There are trade-offs to anything here. We can take the good of that excellent, really early example of government partnership, and maybe we can think about other ways to braid things like traditional education with vocational education. We'll look at a cool example from Europe on that in a little bit later. 1917. That held. That was a really, really popular bill. There was lots of funding. It opened up a lot of opportunities, brought more people to school. If you grew up in an agricultural family, there was still a benefit to you coming and getting early education before moving into that vocational track. But as we hit the 30s and we start seeing kind of industry trying to recover and expand post-World War I, the National Industrial Recovery Act was passed. And what NIRA did was kind of interesting, and it doesn't sound that interesting today, but it established quality standards for trades. It was the first time that any major government institution said, hey, actually, your plumbing pipes shouldn't just explode randomly. Your brickwork shouldn't just fall over. There needs to be codes and standards. And part of what NIRA did was it created expanded funding and opportunity for trade apprenticeships. Because in the opinion of the folks who drafted that bill, that was the way to express those standards. This was before Facebook. This was before Wikipedia. You couldn't post the National Electric Code online or mail out copies of it to everybody. You had to have a way to create these standards and then educate people on them. And NIRA was focused on doing that with small groups of tradespeople. Again, really good thing, really cool thing, something that has carried forward to today. But also, even in 1930, the federal government telling companies that they're going to dictate how they operate wasn't super popular. And so less than a year later, NIRA was totally overturned as unconstitutional. We learned a lot from that, take away some of the good, get out some of the bad. And in 1937, Roosevelt actually signed off on the National Apprenticeship Act, which pulled a lot of language directly from NIRA, specifically around standards of practice and trade communities, building apprenticeships and funding them. And again, cool story, history coming up to today. That National Apprenticeship Act is still what modern registered apprenticeships are built on top of. It's been expanded, it's grown over time. There was an amendment to bring it under the Department of Labor instead of just being an independent federal government program. It's been mentioned and amended to support new types of apprenticeship. So for example, in the 70s, when there was a major healthcare shortage, it was expanded to incorporate nursing as an apprenticeship program eligible for federal funding. We saw the same sort of thing for tech, where it's been expanded to address the need for workers in the tech field. That National Apprenticeship Act really started a lot of what we're doing today with registered apprenticeships, and it is still a vital piece of how we think about policy around this stuff. Super geeky. Again, happy to talk more about that if that's your jam. So here's roughly today. These syncs look pretty modern. I think we're close. Apprenticeships look a lot different than they used to. For one thing, you're not having to send your 8-year-old off to the plumber's house to live there for 10 years. Apprenticeships now are focused much more on vocational skills. They're shorter, but still pretty long. Average apprenticeship is still anywhere from 2 to 4 years for most folks. And they're really, really shifted. We talked earlier about the shift starting to happen with the Industrial Revolution, but we've really locked in most apprenticeships to more construction and manual labor trades. Thought work, there's a little more of that, but it's a lot more creative. There's a lot more flexibility than what we typically see in what most people think of as an apprenticeship. Registered apprenticeship reflects some of that inflexibility. A lot of our regulations are built around the idea of a multi-year trade-focused apprenticeship. We're gonna try to break that down together today, so stick with me on that. It's not perfect, but it's a whole lot better, y'all. This is an earn while you learn model. So modern apprenticeship, apprentices are getting paid. And while there are very often costs involved to joining, something like maybe buying equipment if you want to be an electrician, that's certainly not cheap. Just like buying a computer in a tech apprenticeship isn't cheap. The barrier to entry is a lot lower than it ever has been in history. If we stick with our metaphors and we keep thinking about bridges, we've shortened the bridge. We're still bridging a gap. We're still bridging a really important gap, but it's not this massive bridge that you have to go down over multiple years. It's a lot shorter, it's tighter, the expectations are clearer. And instead of taking people from knowing totally nothing to knowing everything they could possibly know, we're taking folks who are ready to learn, have a little bit of a foundation. We're taking them to the point that they're ready to work. We don't expect that somebody goes from apprentice to master in one step. We break that down, we offer more opportunities, and we're able to bring more people into apprenticeship-supported industries. Good thing, maybe a bad thing. We can talk about perspectives on that. Any questions about history? We're going to take a wild turn in subject here. All right, let's jump forward. All of a sudden, computers. Y'all, if we look at the historical context, remember, we've gone hundreds and hundreds of years, and now we're going to compress this to like the last 30 or 40. We had all of these major technological innovations, computers hit the market, and suddenly things started moving really, really fast. So why is a tech apprenticeship any different than any other apprenticeship? We can do this for trades, we've done this for hundreds of years. Why is it even worth me talking about the differences now? Well, traditional apprentice-supported industries have a long time horizon, right? If you learn to be a plumber, you don't expect clean water to not be a need in a week or a month. That's something that's guaranteed to take a really long time and be around for a long time. And as a result of that, there's well-established practice. We know the basics of it, the ideas behind physics and fluid dynamics, and the reason that you need a vertical stack on a plumbing system so that it's not closed and creates a vacuum. That's all pretty standard. And even as tech changes, those foundational skills move with it. So if you learn to plumb polybutylene in the 70s or 80s, you can apply the same principles you used for that as you replace that polybutylene piping with PEX or something newer. The tech on top of those foundations changes, but the foundations are pretty stable and solid. And finally, we go way back to that idea of trade guilds back in feudal Europe, or medieval Europe. I guess it was technically feudal too. Way back, hundreds of years. Co-location creates camaraderie. When you create a trade guild, you created a place where people came together and were together live and had a community in person where you're not just exchanging direct knowledge transfer, but you're also kind of sharing little tips and tricks, and you're learning from watching and learning from doing. And that's something that we really hadn't seen ways to do that outside of these traditionally co-located large group tradecraft groups. Tech broke all the molds, right? In technology, we don't know what the time horizon is for need. You could learn something today and it could be entirely obsolete 6 months from now. So running a 4-year apprenticeship against a skill that's only in need for 6 months means you are already way behind the curve by the time you graduate from your program. Best practices are really hard to establish in technical roles because, again, foundations change, needs change. The idea of foundational knowledge in tech is kind of flawed. We can look at research level foundations like computer science skills, but when we think about changing market needs, those foundations change underneath them, and what somebody who's a network engineer needs to know is entirely different from what somebody who's a data analyst needs to know. It's really hard to create an overlap of foundational skills that'll grow with you. So if we're having to reteach the foundations all the time, again, a long-term program just doesn't make a lot of sense. And then finally, good thing and bad thing. We're talking a lot about trade-offs here. Tech opens up a distributed workforce in a way that very, very few industries have ever had access to. It's a little bit of an Ouroboros, right? The snake eating its own tail. The technical industry created tools that let us be more distributed, which creates a need for understanding how to train in a distributed environment. That's been new. And for a lot of folks who haven't worked remote before, there are new skills required. There's new things you need. It's a lot tougher and more deliberate to provide training and skill acquisition when you're dealing with somebody from California and you're in South Carolina. So these are new skills we have to build that just aren't built into that classic apprenticeship. Finally, and a really, really big place that messes us up on tech apprenticeships is that with traditional apprenticeships, you're starting from a layperson. You're starting from somebody who has little to no exposure to the field. The reality is, even if we go back pre-computers when folks maybe wrenched on their cars a little more, did a little more work around the house, most people weren't steeped in these industries that they later on apprenticed in. You might have been lucky enough to grow up with an uncle who was a plumber, or you might have learned to do some work yourself before you go out on a job, but the chances are fairly low. And the apprenticeship was built to accommodate for that. We expected that you were starting from zero, coming into an apprentice role with a very, very minimal level of knowledge. And you need a few years to build that experience. You need time before you can really be considered ready to work independently. But now, in 2024, most people, especially in developed economies, but even in less developed ones, have a cell phone. Most people grow up with some access to the internet, and the tools that we use totally expose themselves, right? In your house, you don't have the walls down to understand the plumbing every time you use a sink. You just use the sink. But when you're on the internet and something goes wrong, you see code, you see error messages, you see things that you don't understand, and it's really easy to click on them and learn more about them. That's a kind of a cool, novel thing about technology is it just sort of opens itself up to us. And it's actually very hard to find somebody who doesn't have any skills and who is really, truly at the start of a journey. So this messes up our bridge entirely. Where are we trying to get people to if we don't actually know what the outcome is and we think it may be deprecated by the time they get there? Where are we starting people from if one person might have already built and sold a company in the same time that somebody else learned Python? There's still a bridge we need and there's still a gap. But with these non-traditional technical programs, it's kind of a new model. I'm going to let a tiny little bit of ego sneak in and say this is actually where I kind of joined the conversation. Like I mentioned, my background, I've worked in this area, the technical, non-traditional educational space for a long time. I haven't built programs for plumbers. I haven't built programs for electricians. I have a lot of respect for the traditional trades. It's a great way to go, and they have really great structured programs. I'm not an expert on those, but I am an expert on these non-traditional programs and understanding how we take the lessons from these other programs that I'm tangential enough to respect and learn from, and how we can build something that works well for us, focusing on tech as an industry. I want to get our buzzword quota in. So let's talk about why, with some specific examples, why technology is tricky for this stuff. First one I got to say is AI. If you've been in any talk over 10 minutes where they haven't used the word AI in the past year, you haven't been listening. It's a lot. I know it's a lot. It is a pretty revolutionary thing. And especially working in a tech industry where people are talking about the jobs it's going to take and replace and automate away, there are a lot of really strong feelings about AI. Now, if you're not familiar with some of the history of AI, it's been around, the tools that are really popular right now, right? Specifically things like generative AI, it's the terminology we use. It's been around in an academic sense for 12, 13 years. There were a few years ago, there were a couple little consumer tools that would do interesting things like generate faces or maybe, generate a funny title to a song or something like that. But nothing on the scale that we have today where I could be an AI agent giving this whole talk and probably be indiscernible from my real self. Promise I'm not, but I know that's a possibility. It's grown so fast and there's no sense of how much it will grow in the future. That trying to create even a 2-year program for apprenticeship in AI and machine learning be kind of futile. Because if it continues to grow at the rate it's growing, it's either going to automate us out of the need for that role, or it's going to totally fizzle out. And by the time you graduate from your apprenticeship, there's no opportunity for you. It's just moving too fast to have any sense of what's going to happen next. There's also data. I'm curious from the group, because I know this is folks who are kind of thinking about apprenticeships. How many of you have seen a shift in the job market from software to data over the past couple of years? There is still a need for all of these technical roles. We have not gotten rid of the need for software. We haven't gotten rid of the need for anything. But we have seen companies shifting their language even while they don't change the requirements to focus on data engineering. Just because a lot of tech has gotten to the place where building nice visualizations is pretty quick, but getting the data behind them right and making sure it's useful, it's a lot harder. That's been a big shift in the market. And again, if you started a software program 3 or 4 years ago and you graduate today, all of a sudden everybody wants to hire a data engineer. Where does that leave you with your software certificate? So this gets into kind of that definition of foundational concepts that gets tricky. Electric vehicles is a wild one to think about. A little over a year ago, close to 2 years ago, I was working on a grant because the state of South Carolina had an initiative to build up electric vehicles. They wanted to attract as much business as possible. Today, that is not the case. EVs kind of went through a really nice boom. They're going through a bust right now. And so I don't think it's something that we see a permanent trend down, but I do think we're in a little bit of a valley as we innovate and figure things out. And there's lots of limitations around that, get into green technology and that sort of thing. But again, that's a situation where a longer term program would have a really difficult time predicting the market. And building specifically to that market skill, maybe not the best solution. You have to get a little more creative. And then finally, I want to talk about low code or no code. This is like super popular buzzword with business consultants and freelancers and small companies right now. It's the idea of building no-code platforms. You don't need a developer. You don't need AI. Just use no-code. They're really great. They're really good tools for building quick solutions. They're also really good tools for building the wrong solution. And they can back companies into positions where they can't scale because they're paying per user or per use of a particular technology. So there's trade-offs. Most people who are consulting in the low-code, no-code space are a lot closer to being business consultants than they are to being technical consultants, because those folks are having to get requirements from companies. They're having to make sure they're spending time on the right thing. They're building the correct product to solve a problem and not focusing on writing code like a developer might. So how do we train a technical apprentice who needs to be a business consultant? It's kind of a weird tension that we're faced with as we think about building technical apprenticeships. Are there any industries we're missing here, or any buzzwords y'all can think of that you've seen when looking for jobs, looking for apprenticeships, that maybe we need more service towards?
We got cybersecurity, which is
Yes. UX,
and
UI. That's a
Mhm.
huge one too, Marjorie. Yeah, in Orlando, cybersecurity is massive. That's actually, Build Carolina is going to be rolling out a cybersecurity apprenticeship next year. And it is tricky. As the person responsible for building the curriculum, it's tough to know, where do you start training somebody for cybersecurity, right? You try to train somebody to secure a house. Do you have to make them a general contractor first so they know how it's built? Or do you start from a little bit later in the curriculum? This is tough stuff. There's no right answer, just best fit for now. So here's what we want to do. We don't want to start from scratch. We don't want to try to create something new now in the hopes that it lasts for a few hundred years by itself. We want to take the few hundred years of knowledge we already have and apply it in a novel way. We want to take old tools that we know work, put a little grease on them, give them a little polish, and figure out better ways to use them in the 2020s as compared to the 1420s. Let's talk about some things you can do, thinking about what it means to build an apprenticeship today to address those tricky challenges. The first one we've already kind of talked about, and that's redefining what fundamentals mean. Again, with plumbing, the fundamentals of fluid have not changed. With electricity, if you want to be an electrician, the fundamentals of electrical engineering haven't changed that much. We have fundamentals like that in technology, but what that actually looks like is multiple degrees, because you're talking about electrical engineering, and then you're talking about computer science, and then you're talking about targeted vocational skills. And by that point, you've got a PhD. Most people can't afford to stay in school for 8 years to do a PhD just to get their first job. So we have to think about where we're starting people. And one of the things that we found in our programs, everybody's a little different, so you may find something different for your company. But one of the things we found with our programs is not focusing on tech at all, but focusing on things like business skills. And I mentioned that idea with low code, and we kind of caught on to this before low code became a big thing. So that was a fun verification for us. But what we've seen to be successful with tech apprenticeships is thinking about fundamentals not as a particular technology to deliver, because that's pretty easy to train, all things considered, but thinking about helping people understand how they deliver value, helping people understand how the other people around them work and where they fit on the team. And based on the outcomes we've seen from our program and other programs like it that do focus on that holistic education, those are the things that lead to higher retention. Those are the skills that lead to better offers at the end of the apprenticeship. Those are the skills that lead to longer loyalty. People who understand their team and their company really deeply tend to engage with it and want to stay. So we see really great outcomes for companies coming from redefining those fundamentals from, I need somebody who knows Python, to, I need somebody who can work well on my team. Tangential to that is focusing on learners over lectures. I mentioned that idea of I need somebody who can learn Python, right? If you're building an apprenticeship and you're getting people in and teaching them Python, that's the easiest and lowest effort thing you could possibly do, and also probably the lowest value. Because by the end of the training program, no matter how long it is, there's not a guarantee that company's still using Python. There's not a guarantee that what they learned hasn't changed. There's not a guarantee that there's not some totally new technology out and what they learned is insecure and problematic at this point. Thinking about that cybersecurity perspective, right? That changes every day. So every day you're in a class is a day that you're missing out on industry knowledge. When you're building apprenticeships that need to be flexible and need to focus on these more novel industries, you have to focus on helping people love learning. Get in their heads, focus on just the basic principles of, hey, you're going to learn 10 different things today. We're going to show you how to think about this from 10 different perspectives. And by focusing more on that psychology and the science of how you acquire skills, you're building people who are more resilient and who can jump in faster. So you're not waiting for the industry to meet the skills you need. You're bringing people in who can meet whatever skill you need at any time. And there's also the idea of being a painkiller. And this comes from business fundamentals, but something you see in like MBA programs and that sort of thing is the idea that a business should either offer a painkiller or a vitamin. A painkiller is something that solves an immediate problem, and a vitamin is kind of a nice to have. It's something that maybe builds or makes things better. A lot of non-traditional education programs focus on that vitamin side. We want to improve your team. We want to level things up, but they forget to really give a hook. And so we found as you build these educational programs that it's helpful to go and talk to companies, get to know the people that you're going to be working with, and learn what's bugging them. Figure out where the pain is and take that away with your program, rather than focusing on just general improvement or altruism, right? It's nice you're giving people opportunities. Those things can be true, but as you're building your program, you still need to be solving a problem. That's a really, really key piece for success in these programs. Tech is fast. You can be fast too. We talked about apprenticeships as 7-year, 10-year, 3-4 year in a modern model. But to keep up with tech, you need to be thinking about 6-month to a year apprenticeships at the very longest. This is a newer thing for a lot of people. A lot of folks are sort of calcified in the idea of an apprenticeship as a 3 to 4 year program. And there are ways to build in pre-apprenticeships and additional education, but a successful tech apprenticeship, you've got a year at most to keep up with the industry and keep up with the needs of employers. One way you can speed things up is by focusing on competency over time-based programs. And again, this may require a little bit of administrative education, may require you having conversations with folks to help them understand why a 4-year apprenticeship won't work for you. But a competency-based apprenticeship acknowledges that you're meeting people where they are, and that somebody who maybe has built and sold multiple companies and wants to polish up is a super valuable apprentice to them because of the knowledge they're bringing in. We're recognizing and acknowledging that through signing off on their competencies. This is something that's still a little bit divisive in the registered apprenticeship community, and it's certainly subject to policy changes, but I really, really encourage you, if you're thinking about apprenticeship or wondering if it's right for your company, do some research on competency-based apprenticeships. It's a really, really great force multiplier to get people in quickly. And then finally, I'm going to go back to the title of the talk here, and that is Start with Apprenticeship. Too many companies that we've talked to and that I've worked with even have this mindset that they have to build a team, and they have to have experts on staff, and everybody needs to be super, super senior from day one before they can even think about bringing in junior folks or early career folks or apprentices to support. The reality is, in a technical marketplace, you don't have to do that. You're actually putting yourself at a disadvantage by waiting until you have an expert team, because by the time you have that team, their knowledge is probably already kind of out of date anyway. Whereas if you start with a team of folks who's eager and learning and growing, that momentum continues. You're kicking off a really virtuous flywheel of energy on your team by starting from day one with, hey, we're going to have one mentor, one senior, one supervisor, and then everybody else is going to come in from early career. And they're going to norm and form around this product idea together. You also have the option of using contractors and freelancers to be your subject matter expert. And here's like a weird industry secret, kind of specific to tech. Can't speak to other industries, but I know it for technical roles. If you're hiring contractors or you're hiring freelancers, you're already getting this effect. Most contractors, freelancers, independent consultants are part of communities where they're sharing knowledge. They're leveling up with people outside your company. They're getting mentorship from people who are not on their direct team, and you're getting the benefit of that, but you're paying way more money for that independent consultant who's having to pay their software coach. You can bring all of that in-house and still get the advantage of an outside mentor through an apprenticeship if you start early. If you wait, that's a lot of time and money that you've spent building a very senior team that's going to have a harder time getting the advantage of these bigger communities. I know we're coming up close to time here, so I want to be kind of quick thinking about some examples from on the globe, but let's pull some practical examples in. I think these are valuable. I want to start with not a great example, and that is up here in jolly old England. The UK in 2017 instituted a federal program that said any company of a certain size or larger has to invest a percentage of their revenue back into apprenticeship. Really, really well intentioned, but did not work out at all. It's been seen as an abject failure by most folks in the UK. The reasons for that are complex, and I'm not going to pretend to be a political science major, but in short, it just didn't get used. Didn't really have teeth. It focused on larger companies that really weren't interested in that or weren't getting a benefit from it, and also didn't really suffer from a need for workforce. They had people coming to them already. So that's a really good example of the best intentions not leading to the outcomes that we can flip that, compare that to something like in the United States, the Urban Institute. This is a company that Build Carolina has partnered with, and talked to some other folks who partnered with them. Really, really great group to work with. They focus more on getting access to government grants, large-scale opportunities, bringing them to smaller businesses and smaller teams. And they do that not by trying to be the only body in charge of it, but by being a conduit to support small programs. So really kind of the direct opposite of that, I think it was the apprenticeship levy in the UK, but really impactful, really positive, really great way to approach the idea of building apprenticeships and building non-traditional pathways for early career learners. We can switch over somewhere like Switzerland. And I mentioned earlier we were going to talk about Switzerland's program. They rolled out years ago the Vocational Education and Training Program, which is a government-sponsored system that requires all educational facilities to offer not just purely academic roles, but also vocational. Similar to that Smith-Hughes bill that the US passed in 1917, but with a little bit more flexibility and a lot more public support. And what they see today is 75% or so of young people choose to go through an apprenticeship-backed educational track. Massive, massive adoption. That means companies based out of Switzerland have lots of apprentices. That means apprentices are everywhere. You have apprentice bankers, you have apprentice technologists, you have apprentices in the trades. It's not as limited as a lot of the US's scope has been. And Switzerland is certainly not hurting in terms of their GDP per capita or just being one of the wealthiest countries in the world, if not the wealthiest. It's a good place to be. An apprenticeship has benefited them. And so the government and the state pays back into those programs. They are really, really beloved. Those programs have also leaked out. So Germany, Finland, Sweden, a lot of Central and Northern Europe have taken cues from that and built it into their public education. And the US has actually brought folks over as recently as 2021 to talk about applying the Swiss model into US public schools. Hasn't been a lot of traction. It's been tested in some small schools. I found a couple little studies on that, but it's a big enough program that little baby Switzerland in Europe is inspiring the rest of the world, just with registered apprenticeships. And then finally, let's talk about Kenya, a continent that doesn't get a lot of attention when we think about technology and training and developing nations. But Kenya in 2022 realized there was this opportunity to give their folks new work in a developing space. And they created a program called, and I want to make sure I get this right, the Presidential Digital Talent Program, the PDTP. 2022, they had a goal of serving 1,000 people. And the purpose of this program was to take folks that already had skills. It wasn't to take people coming straight out of public education. It wasn't to take people who didn't know what they were doing. To take all these people who had technical skills but couldn't find work and connect them. And they did that by offering additional education through academic programs. They partnered with corporations to basically earmark roles and say, hey, we know we're going to have folks. Can we bring them to you? Will you help give them this apprenticeship opportunity? They partnered with the tech community, places like CoWorks and local community organizations where they could say, hey, we know you've been over here hanging out looking for jobs. We have an opportunity for you. They were hoping to train 1,000 people between 2022 and 2023. In 2 years, they've trained 2,100. 1,700 graduates since they launched, and they're expecting another 400 by the end of 2024. So the next couple months, there'll be some graduation caps thrown in Kenya. That's awesome. And we know from tech being a really high yield industry that that's life-changing for communities in Kenya. You're bringing in funding that they may not have access to. You're bringing in massive opportunities. These are all great examples of apprenticeship in action, an apprenticeship that is novel, that doesn't stick to the idea of a required 4-year structure. So let's go back to that bridge, right? Where does this leave us with tech apprenticeships if we're going from the long bridge to the medium bridge to the short bridge full of question marks? Ultimately, using these non-traditional apprenticeships means we can take people who are ready to grow. No matter where they're at, we can find folks, we can tailor them, we can create pre-apprenticeships that support them. We have lots of flexibility for how we join the bridge, and we're taking them to a place of positive impact. And that's the fun thing is we're no longer defining that just as ready to work or ready to join the workforce or ready to perform a particular skill, but we're taking them to a place where they're going to have a good impact no matter what. And I've added a second bridge here, and maybe this is the next talk, or maybe this is a conversation we can have after. But one of the great things we've seen in running an apprenticeship like this and focusing on these non-traditional learners and bringing people in on an accelerated path is that generally, when you have a positive impact in one place, you want to have it in others. And so we see lots of people taking the bridge the other way to help support other folks coming in. And going back to that idea of the virtuous flywheel of building momentum, having these short targeted apprenticeships in an industry that needs them is a great way to get people out and involved and also giving back so that ultimately your impact has more impact, which is I think what we're all kind of hoping for from our careers and our. With that, y'all, let's talk about it. I see I've got some chat to catch up on. I do have my contact information here if you'd like to follow up, have any questions. I'd be happy to share my slides with you as well. There's nothing private here. But I'm curious to hear what your perspectives are, what you're worried about, what you're thinking about, and whether we can help. So thank y'all for watching and for joining us. Marjorie is writing code in chat. I'm just impressed. Nice.
I was going to say that's an Alex joke if I ever saw one.
Oh yeah, that's solid. Hey, Marjorie, what you got for us?
Yes. Hey there, Alex. First of all, thank you and Lauren for for tonight and the opportunity to be here. So I do have a question. In looking over job descriptions, a lot of entry-level positions are requiring 1 to 3 years, maybe more of experience. So for somebody who's just coming out of a boot camp, would you say that an apprenticeship would be enough to fill that requirement?
Yeah, that is a great question. And the answer to that question has evolved. If you asked me that 5 years ago, I would have told you apply. 1 to 3 years, really anything under 5 years is entry level to me. And so companies are aspirational. Job descriptions sometimes say, hey, we want 3 years, but that's very rarely used to be very rarely a hard and fast rule. As the market has gotten tighter, those requirements have gotten more solid. And so what I would have said in 2019 is very different than what I'm going to say in 2024, which is I would cut those estimates in half. If you're looking at a company that wants 1 to 3 years of experience and you've done a 6-month boot camp, I think you'd be okay applying. Might not hurt to continue growing and think about some non-traditional education pathways, but I wouldn't say an apprenticeship is required. That said, that is also the kind of thing we look for as we're trying to find companies to work with, is places that are hiring in that range of experience, because that's really what we want to try to bring to them is to say, hey, and Marjorie, I don't know your background, but I'll use you as an example. Marjorie has been learning on her own for a year, building cool things, and then she did a boot camp for, let's say, 6 months, or let's say even 3 months. So really, she's coming to you with a year and a half of experience. What do you need to support her? What do you need to feel confident in her? And that, to me, is really the role of the apprenticeship, is we want to provide training for learners, but we also want to provide education and training for companies to make sure it's a good mix. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And to expand to that, so in terms of that, say, professional experience, would that have to have been something in tech, or is it just something that you could have maybe just acquired some soft skills in?
Yes. All right. I'm going to tell one of my favorite stories to answer the question. I worked with somebody who was a boot camp grad, was a career changer later in life, had a lot of things against her and felt it, like really struggled with applying for jobs just because she kind of felt beat down. And she asked me to look at her resume at one point, and she had all of her technical work on it. She said, I've done JavaScript, I've done these frameworks, I've worked with these tools, I've built these projects. But I realized that she didn't mention that she was a member of a local symphony orchestra. She was a horn player and had been for a really long time, was very proud of sharing that with her friends. And I just kind of casually said, like, hey, throw that on your resume. Like, I don't know if it'll pay off, but people want a hook. They want something interesting. And if I'm reading resumes, I'm going to be a lot more interested in seeing that you're a musician than I am in seeing another person who knows JavaScript. And I don't say this taking credit like this is what got her the job. But a few months later, she was still applying and she reached out to me and she said, hey, I actually just got a position at the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts in DC. Because they were looking for somebody to do website management for them, but they wanted somebody who knew the industry, who would kind of connect to the work they were doing. And they saw on her resume that she was a musician. So Again, I don't say that with ego, like I can get you a job if you put your hobbies on your resume, but I do say that to really reinforce from a practical example that those soft skills that you mentioned, the professional skills you have, the work you've done in the past, even your hobbies, are going to make you a better rounded technologist and make you stand out in the process way more than the amount of code you've written or the systems you've supported or the certifications you've gotten. Those are important. Got to have the skills to do the job, but being a well-rounded human is maybe more important. So in terms of things like work experience, you should absolutely think about how can the other things I've done build on or contribute to this team. And that should be part of what you're talking about in interviews. It's like, hey, I worked in a bank and I worked with these really complicated systems and I know a lot about security and architecture and access control. And those things can all be part of your professional experience sort of body of work. Oh, and Adrienne makes a great call in chat. I want to make sure it makes it in the recording as well. Things like volunteer work, totally you should include that. That is a huge part of humanizing you and also something you can benefit from on the job. Great call, thank you. Any other questions or things you're curious about? All right. Well, y'all, I will stop the share here for just a moment and say thank you again very, very much for joining us live. If you are revisiting this after the presentation tonight, feel free to contact me. I remember my contact information is on that last slide, and I'm sure we'll share that with the event invite that you found this through as well. Happy to chat more about this stuff. Happy to be challenged on anything I said here that you disagree with or you have anecdotes about. I don't think there's any such thing as a fixed objective truth in a lot of this work. So I think we all grow by talking about it. Hope this was helpful for those of you who are seeking apprenticeship. Again, just thinking about how companies might be thinking about these roles and what they may be looking for from you, and also what you can bring to them and how you can kind of make that pitch a little more compelling. And I am also more than happy to talk about that if you'd like to reach out to me at any point. But otherwise, thanks for your time. Appreciate you being here and keep building apprenticeships, y'all.